So I'm hoping.
Yes, I hear you. Well, okay. Hello, everybody. We're chugging through this book, Therapy of Desire. We're in chapter 11 now, Seneca on anger in public life. We were just discussing how it's sort of become a bit of an error, isn't it? We read it in like a week ago, and then you get to talking about it, and the chapters are 30 and 40 pages long, and it's often quite hard to recall everything that we've read, given our busy lives, right? So just to jump in, I made a few short notes on one. See, I'm such a cheat. I know that I can do one because there's not too many notes here. She's decided to introduce us to the topic of anger, and she's using Seneca's De Ira as the kind of Stoic position. Interestingly, though, as we go along through this text, we'll realize that it's probably not canonically Stoic, with Seneca's perspective on mercy being contrasted with the more hardline Greek Stoic perspective. At least that's Nussbaum's analysis as she goes along. So Nussbaum gives us three stories that she wants to frame as different perspectives on anger. One of them, and she got this idea for this topic, she says, because she was at a US military academy at West Point talking with the lecturers. Well, she was the lecturer talking with the army people, the generals or whoever, and they discussed several cases. One of them was this American platoon. An American platoon entered a Vietnamese village looking for Viet Cong soldiers, helpers, supplies. When the inhabitants of the village refused to cooperate, the commanding officer, enraged at the Gooks, who are to him all enemies and not fully human, orders his men to open fire. And this came after months of frustration and suffering in the jungle. The invitation to revenge is delightful. Anger floods over them, sweet as a reward. So this is one kind of aspect of anger, is that she will later say kind of gives us the condition for seeing the objects of our anger as less than human, less than us, so it debases them. And then that kind of paves the way for atrocity, is sort of the idea. Another idea she gives us from another story is that during the war in the Gulf, General Norman Schwarzkopf got on the radio. Um, he was discussing new evidence regarding the torture of civilians in Kuwait. And she says he speaks with contagious anger in his voice. He says that he does not know how to speak about the people who did these horrible acts. In a way, that that's reinforcing the first point, isn't it? Because he's debasing the people he's talking about. But on the other hand, it also shows the slippery slope of righteous anger because it's infectious and it can spread to other people. And that's apparently how it was being used there to justify the war, perhaps. And then she gives another example, the third story of a young child who was in the Nazi death camp, Eli Wiesel. Um, and when the Allied forces arrived, there was a very large black officer walking, and he walked into camp and seeing the terrible things that had been done, he began to curse, shouting at the top of his voice. As the child Wiesel watched, he went on shouting and cursing for a very long time, and the child Wiesel thought, watching him now humanity has come back. Now with that anger, humanity has come back. So that's a very powerful image there too, and one that's difficult to deny. Goes her argument. Um, so she basically on page 404 is telling us that anger asserts the importance of human moral concerns, but at the same time, it debases its object and summons against the object energies that can also be easily be used for Calais-style brutality. So not only, like in Wiesel's soldier's case, can it signify the reaction of humanity against some sort of atrocity, it can also be used to debase and do terrible things. So there's a double-edged kind of element to anger, and she gives us the account of well, she points out this doubleness by talking about the contrast between Achilles and Odysseus, because Achilles' wrath, sweeter than honey, brought thousandfold pains upon the Achaeans, and it led him to treat the corpse of his enemy in a base and dehumanizing manner. It's only when, with Priam, he puts aside his anger that he's able to recognize the equal humanity of his foe. And then, yet at the same reader who fears Achilles' wrath cheers the anger of Odysseus that sets to right the damage to his house, cheers as the evil and not fully humanized suitors and their allies are shot, strung up, humiliated, hacked to bits. I remember reading that. I hadn't read much ancient Greek stuff, and I must admit I was really pleasantly shocked because I was a young male how graphic the description was. I think in one text, the one I was reading, must have been a Penguin, it describes Odysseus stringing up one of the suitors and hacking off his genitals and feeding them to the dogs. So that's quite a graphic image. And like it says, you tend to you cheer Odysseus on because the suitors have been sufficiently dehumanized, probably partly by the narrative, but also because we all kind of see the wrongness of what's going on in his absence. So that is the trouble with anger, and that's kind of where she takes us into part two. Can't the pleasure of anger itself lead us straight from one into the other? Can we then cultivate humanity in public life, either with anger or without it? We're kind of left with this idea that the anger seems so necessary, and it almost seems like it's an appropriate reaction to witnessing an atrocity. But the other side of that is it transforms the object of that anger into something less than human that we can then in turn debase and destroy and do horrible things to. So I think that's the kind of tension that she's talking about in anger. That's the end of that part. Does anyone have anything you want to say or add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to add, and she puts this in footnote 2 on page 404, that she's grateful to Jonathan Shea for drawing her attention to a program where Vietnam vets were involved in readings and learnings about the Iliad. Now that led to the wonderful, wonderful book, which I'm sure I've talked about before and you've heard me go on about it, Achilles in Vietnam by Jonathan Shea. And I think it was 1994, the same year that Nussbaum's book came out. And it's a wonderful book. And what Shea sets out through his work with vets suffering from PTSD, and looking at the Iliad from a kind of perspective like that, is he discerns that when somebody in combat has had their moral compass disrupted, and that can be through a number of reasons. So, for instance, in Achilles' case, it's when his friend and lover Patroclus, a great and good man, a gentle warrior, when Patroclus is killed by Hector, Achilles loses his moral bearings. And so whereas beforehand he was a courteous warrior, then he sends something shifted, and then he just went into a killing spree, a complete series of atrocities. And I can't remember which book of the Iliad it is, but it just goes one after the other, telling how he speared this one and he beheaded that one and he hacked this one down. It just goes on and on and on. And it's so Shea's point is that our moral framing is calibrated, and if some event happens which disrupts that, It can be also, say, as it was often in Vietnam, where an order was made from above that resulted, for example, in friendly fire, or somebody's mates being killed without any good reason, or some absolute cock up that could have been avoided. That kind of thing can also shift people's moral compass and lead them to ceasing to care about the norms of civilized relations in combat. And that has led to atrocities, for instance, in Vietnam or in later combats. So as I say, the book's well worth reading on its own. But I was so glad to see that she must have touched base with Jonathan Shea, because that is exactly what he's talking about. The fact that that the moral that these are moral issues, and that that they are, well, they can be fragile to a degree, particularly in situations of very high stress. So, and in a sense, it's a particular kind of anger that is the anger of Achilles, and that is the anger that John Strain's talking about. There are, I suppose, other kinds as well, but this is the kind she's obviously, I think, referring to in section 1 here.
And may I also point out, just thank you, Drew. That was I didn't really read that footnote. Thank you. The other point I thought there, because of not having studied Aristotle very much, it was good that she's brought in that comparison where Aristotle refers to a lack of reaction and a lack of feeling of for revenge as slavish. You know, that word slavish keeps coming back into his description of someone that doesn't rise in retaliation. And yeah, so anyway, it was just an adjective you see pop up a few times within the text, you know.
I think it's also important to, if you finished, Jodie, are you done?
Yep.
Sorry. Important to notice that the kind of anger they're talking about here is definitely a passion. Often in modern times, what gets passed off as anger doesn't really. I'm curious about whether or not it's exactly what the Stoics are talking about. Like, for example, I had a psychologist on the radio the other day, and he was making the claim that we all experience anger all the time, probably hundreds of times a day, because we would just say that minor irritation or something like that, you know. But the way they, yeah, you know what I'm saying? So a passion would be something that has cognitive kind of parts to it, which we've discussed previously, and it has a certain specific content, like extreme, very high evaluation of worth to some external thing that is being damaged or harmed in some way, and therefore that harm or damage kind of creates a desire or longing to inflict that harm upon another person that deserved harm. That is the kind of passion that they're talking about here, not slamming your finger in the door or you know, something very, very different, I think.
Missing that car space in the car park, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly. And I think that's important to notice, because when the psychologists go, well, anger is really useful and normal because you're experiencing moments of anger like hundreds of times throughout the day, like, you know, you left your pen in the car when it should have been in your pocket. It's like, well, no, I think we're using the term slightly differently, and therefore it has a consequence for the kind of what they're trying to talk about in terms of what it means to have emotions, because are we really talking about the same thing? Or what does a therapy look like? Because obviously the Stoics might say those small annoyances might just be minor reaching out of the body, you know, of the soul or whatever. They might be just I don't know. They're definitely not passions anyway. They might be proto passions. They might be impressions scraping along the surface of the soul. Yeah, what do you call them? First movements. There might be those sorts of things. Anyway, just
Yeah,
wanted
that's
to
really
add that.
interesting, Courtney. And I suspect what you've just identified there probably denotes some kind of shift in these classifications. So yeah, I totally agree that I don't think the minor irritations that are part and parcel of a normal life should be should be elevated to the status of anger. And if they are, maybe we need to we need to really look at that. That seems rather surprising, but can I ask? I mean, I suppose it's taking us a bit off the track, but what did the person on the radio say in relation to these sort of multiple instances of anger in the day?
Well, they were just trying to make the point that people can quite easily control anger, and that it was a thing that could be cultivated, learning to manage anger, because obviously you do it all the time in the background. That was kind of the idea. Obviously, the kind of anger the Stoics are talking about when they talk about the argument of excess is that the ball's already well and truly rolling from our point of view, and it's already, you're already in quite a state. You've already assented to certain beliefs. And remember, in the last one, we're talking about the Chrysipian view, and that is the belief is identical with the emotion. So to have the emotion is to have the belief. To have the belief is to have the emotion. It's the same thing. But from that modern cognitive neuro point of view, that quite famous cognitive neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett, I rewatched one of her videos recently. She said something very interesting. She was saying she's been doing brain research for 30 years around emotion, and her conclusion, looking at brain studies and that in a very detailed, thorough way, was that emotions are predictions, but also our bodies are a kind of basic barometer for the environment. So what she was saying is, you might wake up in the morning and you have a strange feeling in your body because it's your body going, something's not quite right here, and it starts making predictions. So your mind starts racing, she says, and she was saying you might start thinking, because you're trying to match up that weird feeling with something that it could be in the environment. So you start thinking of, do I have to go and pick up the kids from school today? Have I left the laundry at my friend's house? Whatever, your mind starts racing. Pretty soon you're doing what the psychologists call ruminating, and you're going over and over and over things, and then you interpret that as anxiety. And so she's saying what we're doing when we're doing those sorts of things is not actually having first the experience of anxiety. We're predicting that we're having anxiety, and we're working ourselves into that state because we've made that prediction before, and it's kind of socially or culturally endorsed that that's what's going on. That's what you're experiencing. So her modern uptake from a scientific point of view is we need to be more creative in the interpretations that we give our somatic feelings. So you might instead go, well, what is that feeling I'm having? And instead of going, that's anger, like the psychologist before was doing, we should defer that judgment. We should defer that interpretation because we have that rational part that's up to us. We could actually go, yeah, it's true, I'm having a certain feeling, body state, somatic experience, but I'm not going to name it yet. I'm going to sit with it for a little bit. I know what it is. I've got pins and needles in my foot, or whatever, or I'm hungry, or I'm tired, or that's right. I didn't do my homework from yesterday and I'm nervous about the results. Whatever it is, it might require a bit more of a searching effort on our part. And her point is, the conclusions that we draw and the interpretations that we give our affective states will kind of seed them for the future. So rather than making ourselves anxious and paranoid, we could actually make ourselves cautious and mindful about the things that we need to do, for example. So it's taking responsibility and not falling into the trap of calling everything anger when it doesn't have to be. Sorry for that long segue. I just get kind of a bit worked up about those things.
That's okay. Just before we get to two, and Jodie, I'm happy if you want to do two. I just wanted to just go back to the Jonathan Shea thing, because just to, I suppose, put in a more put in a Stoic framing, which I don't think he does, looking back on the book, although I'm only partway through rereading it. I think that if we wanted to put it into a Stoic framing, what happens to these people who, for usually in combat, something disastrous happened, and then they go and do some other atrocity. There is that if we are to identify the cognitive element there, it's that if and it's like a conditional, right? If it's okay that my friend was brutally massacred back there, then it must be okay that I do this, or it must be normal that I do this, or it must be appropriate that I do this. Or if it's okay that our superiors made that bloody stupid order back there that resulted in our mates being isolated out there and cut to bits, then it's then standards have gone sideways and it's appropriate for me to do this. So even I'd say there is that cognitive framing if we're to look at it in that sense. So yeah, I think it's possible to look at that loss of moral moral rightness, really, which is what she's pointing to in some of these cases, obliquely or explicitly. I think we can possibly frame that in a Stoic way, but I just wanted to show that, put that out there. But happy for you to go on with 2, Jodie, if you want to.
Just quickly too, just for a bit of fun facts for anyone watching, that if-then stuff, the cognitive behavioral therapists call that conditional assumptions. So they're the kind of rules of life, they like to say, that we have that are below the level of normal surface belief, getting closer to core beliefs. And it's quite entertaining to pin them down. And you're right. It'd be like, if someone does that to me, then, they deserve to be blah, blah, blah. So that's quite interesting. Anyway.
And and I think later in the chapter too, I think it's discussed, isn't it? That idea of training on the small stuff, training on the small stuff to enable us to be more aware when we're challenged on something bigger. Yeah. But anyways, I'll kick off 2. I'll just read you my notes. I'll probably get through it pretty quick, and then we can talk it over. Deira. So we're on page 405. Deira is a therapeutic argument addressed to his brother, who has characteristic Roman concerns, like military concerns, success, safety of family and home, strength and dignity, manliness, those sorts of qualities. There are references to Claudius and Caligula with allusions to their anger and crimes, and shows concern for the future of public life, so that it is aimed at the individual and the broadly social. This is we're talking about Deira overall, just to look at it as an overall piece of work. 406, I'm on. Some critics have said Deira lacks structure and sequence. Nussbaum sort of agrees and sort of doesn't agree. So anyway, she describes the structure. Book 1 as responding to Aristotelian criticisms to the Stoic position. Then book 2 has a critique of the Epicurean positions. This is very broad. And book 3, practical Roman concerns, and he discusses the Sextius, who was his teacher. Is that right? His teacher. Nussbaum will use one central piece of philosophical therapy from the work, which is addressed to a non-Stoic interlocutor, Novatus. He has asked Seneca's help in how to deal with anger. So that's the purpose of the piece. Seneca will attempt to show him how to cut anger out of our minds, or certainly to run it in and curb its impetus. Novatus, being an ambitious, self-respecting Roman man, sees anger as imported as a response to evils, and for strong, manly military life. So there is deep resistance when Seneca will have that Seneca will have to overcome. So Novatus is very much the Roman man. So he's addressing really many of the the typical attitudes of the time. We're on page 407. An anonymous third person voice will repeatedly bring up the connection of anger with dignified punishment of wrongdoing, with honor and greatness of soul, that it can be moderate and self-contained. His arguments are spontaneous, repetitive, and tumultuous. Seneca will grapple with this, not in an elegant and neatly ordered logical argument, which is impossible, because it's sort of these sort of intermittent people, these interrupting comments. So he can't really have a proper structure in grappling with it. So the structure of Diara, Nussbaum argues, is the drama of the therapy. The Stoic position emerges gradually, and the worthlessness of externals only appears almost at the end. So book one's focus on Aristotle and Theophrastus is close to the interlocutor's own position, his own intuitions. We're on 408. Book two has more detailed, book two is more detailed with some technical discussion of Stoic passion theory with Stoic rival views. And book three has many exemplar relevant to Roman life. The course of Novatus's therapy is as follows. He confesses to fear of anger, and he asks Seneca to tell him how to moderate it, not to extirpate it, just to moderate it. His views are close to those of Aristotle and Theophrastus. He can moderate anger without removing it completely. It is a useful and motivating force. Anger is right as a reaction to being wronged or harmed. The interlocutor speaks frequently on this part with many objections. Seneca leads him gently, stressing similarities to Aristotle's position on anger and natural tendencies to goodness. By book two, the interlocutor shows serious interest in the Stoic position. And Seneca now presents him with Stoic arguments about the passions, with less frequent resistance. Seneca now broaches the topic of remedies for anger, and then questions on education. We're moving down 409 here. At the end, the interlocutor confesses a deep personal interest and pleasure in punishing, which also improves his sense of honor and self-esteem. So he's really being honest here. You know, he's really admitting, well, really, I really like revenge. You know, it makes me feel good. So, you know, we are now at the bottom of his soul. This is 410, to which Seneca responds. So in book three, Novatus longs to have anger totally removed from his soul. So he's really being talked around at this point. Novatus can see how, for his current perceptions are from Aristotelian intuitions with which he began. The examples of the badness of anger when uncontrolled are given, and the possibilities for its removal also are given. Stoic doctrine is now introduced. The instability of fortune, the worthlessness of externals, the need to live so as not to be damaged by fortune, the cultivation of humanitas, which requires the removal of anger. So that takes us right up to 3 then. So it's really just a summary of the structure of the book, isn't it? Part 2. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it very interesting, the idea that Seneca starts out trying to meet Novatus where he already is, and where he already is sort of broadly speaking holding Aristotelian and the views of Theophrastus, and then he works him through the therapy until he's ready to sort of take on the more Stoic elements, if you like, of the argument. And I think that makes a lot of sense if you view what Seneca is doing as a therapy. Because if he'd have just started with an argument, you know, that this is what the Stoics think, and these are the rational grounds for it, that might not have the same sort of therapeutic impact that his particular style has. And we did the Schopenhauer one the other day, and I wondered if it was a similar kind of thing that was going on Providence, because he tends to leave it, at least I thought after reading this, that it was more of the serious Stoic kind of elements came at the end, and especially right at the end, he goes on about suicide and death, and he saves that right to the end. He doesn't start with that, that's for sure. So yeah, just something to think about. I thought it was very interesting, and I wondered if it was maybe just the way Seneca likes to do his therapy, mate. Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
No, I think that's right. Just to clarify one thing that Nussbaum assumes you're going to know. Towards the beginning there of section 2, Novatus and the speaker inside the text who, intervening simply with inquit, may or may not be identical with Novatus. Inquit means he said, right? So it's like in a third person. And then later on, when we're getting more to the nitty-gritty and more right into Novatus' soul, she says that the interlocutor starts saying, Seneca starts saying that the interlocutor says, in quiz, which means, and that second person, that means you say. So it becomes a direct address to the interlocutor. So just to clarify that, which she assumes you're going to know, but readers who aren't familiar with Latin aren't going to know. And yes, I think she does a brilliant job here of explaining how Seneca goes about it, and how he first takes one tack, then another, starts with, going from a broadly Aristotelian position, or at least entertaining those notions in section 1, towards a more aggressive, I would say, engagement with anger. And I think she does a wonderful job again of presenting De Ira as therapeutic. I think I'm convinced she's won me, against those scholars who would say, oh, it's so unsystematic. It's like, and it seems to me that's a kind of a lowest common denominator, scholarly criticism, right? Anyone in the 20th century can turn to someone in a previous century and say, oh, they weren't very systematic, were they? It's like that. You can kind of divide through for that, right? Because I think, as she does, I think we've just got to attend to what he's actually doing, and then the structure will gradually emerge. And not to imagine that we can impose some, or we can predict some structure that we think should be there. And I think certain scholars such as Sellers and Gill, Redham, Shills, have all pointed to the ancient Stoics, and Graeber, of course, as well. The ancient Stoics, with this kind of 20th century criticism, oh, they weren't very systematic. Well, actually, they were. If we're going to attend properly to the structure of what it is that they were doing, it's not to present a coherent worldview to be presented in an academic paper. It's what it's aimed at is transforming the soul of the interlocutor and of the reader and of the writer. That's what it's aimed at. And on that basis, yes, there is a system, and we can, if we're attentive and we don't try and impose our own preconceptions on it, we can discern it. Sorry, that was just a rant.
No, that's really interesting, and it reminded me of Pierre Hadot as well, who says, he's writing within a certain kind of tradition, and so we shouldn't, like you say, impose these artificial kind of forms on top of that. And to understand the therapeutic nature of the tradition is to kind of elucidate what he's actually trying to do. And it makes sense, because Stoicism is not an academic philosophy. It's a therapeutic philosophy. It's designed to, like you say, transform the soul. And Seneca clearly makes it very clear that he's not writing as one would write a book. He's writing as if he was having a conversation with somebody. And he says that's how philosophy ought to be done. It would be done best face to face, but this is what I've got to work with is through letters or whatever. So yeah, he's engaging in a kind of talk therapy, and he's a real pioneer in that tradition. So it's really interesting.
So I'm happy to go on with 3.
Right.
If we're happy to do that. Okay, so she outlines that Seneca's central line of argument is going to have 3 parts. An account of anger that shows it to be non-natural and non-necessary, an artifact of judgment, erroneous judgment, obviously. The argument that anger is not necessary or even useful as a motivation for correct conduct. And finally, and this is probably the one that gets the most publicity, I would say, an argument from excess, showing Novartis that the angry person is prone to violence and cruelty. And so let's take each of these in turn. And we start with this cognitive view, which is close to the Aristotelian one, that the person who responds in anger wants to see a return of pain for pain or injury for injury. There's an idea, there's a vengefulness there. Cupiditas ulciscendi injuriae, a desire to avenge the injury. So what is this cupiditas, or in Greek epithumia? Well, is it a judgment? Well, perhaps we can leave that question aside for the minute, just to recognize that it exists. And it's not for some natural aggressive instinct in human nature, because obviously the Stoics don't think that that is the case, that humans are not naturally aggressive. Because and now on page 412 rather, there's a lengthy quote from section 152, some rhetorical questions. What is gentler than the human being when he is in a right state of mind? But what is more cruel than anger? What is more loving to others than the human being? What more hostile than anger? So this is reinforcing the Stoic idea that naturally humans are loving rather than aggressive. And so she says, Seneca is not altogether explicit at this point concerning the judgments that are at the root of this non-natural passion. And we'll get a bit further into that later on. But given that even the Aristotelian position makes judgments of a certain sort necessary conditions for anger, Seneca is, with this interlocutor, on safe ground. Anger is in some way or another a social artifact, a product of what we are taught to believe and judge. And that being established, the argument can then shift to what she has called the motivational argument and the argument for excess. So if we look at the motivational argument, it's around anger as an appropriate response to a wrong action. So as she quotes, ratio, that's Latin for reason, is by itself sufficient in war, in defending one's own, even in punishing offenders. And the argument that it's kind of appropriate or not to respond in a certain way is inappropriate is reinforced, as she argues, by the familiar argument from excess. And this takes us on to page 413. One way in which anger is a bad motivational force is that it is prone to exceed the boundaries set by reason. So there's all these images that anger is like a body hurled headlong from a height, or it's like a man running down a hill and he can't stop himself. He's gone too far. Contrary to what Aristotle says, anger is not like a useful weapon, for a good weapon like virtue or reason is firm, constant, obedient. But anger is double-edged and capable of being turned against its master. Or, I might add, against third parties who have nothing to do with the issue. That's another way in which anger goes beyond its bounds, is where the person who's angry is so wrought up or carried away that they make some error around who is the appropriate target, or who or what is the appropriate target. And so then we get some exemplar from Roman history. and in opposition, in contrary to anger, we've got the patience of Fabius Cunctator, who was a famous general who defeated Hannibal. And Cunctator means the delayer. You know, he kept putting things off with having fighting against Hannibal, who had invaded Italy. And eventually he prevailed. The patience of Scipio in front of Numantia, clemency of Caesar, the gentle, moderate behavior sometimes of Augustus, but also the contrast, horrendous excesses of public anger, Caligula, the crimes of Sulla, mass killings of Bolessus, murderous anger of Alexander, and many others, with a crescendo of ugliness and horror that culminates in Book 3 in ghastly tales of mutilation and torture. And then she gives us one of these. This is Vettius Pollio, who was a Roman aristocrat who had these pet moray eels in this luxurious fish tank. And then a slave of his had broken a crystal goblet, and Vettius Pollio was enraged and was about to throw him to the eels to devour him. But then Augustus happened to be there for dinner, and the slave threw himself at Augustus's feet and appealed for mercy. And Augustus was horrified, and the emperor delivered a singularly stoic speech. Do you order men to be snatched away from a banquet and tortured with new forms of punishment? If your goblet is broken, will the bowels of a human being be torn apart? Are you so arrogant that you will order a man to be led to death in the presence of Caesar? And so this is what rage can lead us to. Okay.
Well, you know, that point there at the end, I think there's a really clever hidden message in there too. Are you so arrogant that you will order a man to be led to death in the presence of Caesar? If we read Epictetus and those sort of characters, we know that the rational part is something given to us by the divine figure. So it elevates us beyond even Caesar's family. So for us to kill another man who also has a part which belongs to God is sort of like what's going on here, acting as if they were more, what does he say? More arrogant even than Caesar. His own human bodily concerns, his own pettiness, he elevates over the divine part, and he betrays himself when he behaves like that, and acts atrociously because he's devaluing that inner divine part. I mean, that's how I kind of took the little double meaning in there. Does that make sense? Am I explaining myself properly?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I guess too, when one human, Vettius Pollio in this case, has the power of life or death over another human, a slave in this case, then unfortunately the risks are exponentially increased that the slave owner will adjudicate as if he were a Caesar or a god, rather than a human who is essentially the equal of the other human. So I think that little anecdote invites us to think of all these issues.
Yeah, the way in which social convention masquerades, but takes an unrightfully higher position than the cosmopolitan kind of, that we're all equal amongst each other kind of idea. Yeah, a person should have that dignity in mind at all times, even if they are obeying social convention. And that seems to be the point that Seneca is making, that we should go to mercy and clemency and the like. But obviously, I just wanted to make it clear too, that idea of motivation, that anger is a motivation. You explained it well, but I also want to kind of just really touch that point, that the argument seems to be suggesting that if we didn't have anger, then we wouldn't be motivated to endure all of the difficulties of obtaining justice. So it's kind of considered a necessary motive force. And the argument, of course, against that is no, one can still undergo all kinds of hardships without getting angry in order to get justice, because they hold justice in the appropriate regard for what it is.
And justice per se, and this goes back to the very origins of Greek justice. which kind of emerged out of legend and myth, the whole idea of justice is that it takes one step aside from interpersonal feuds, grievances, revenge. The whole point of justice is that it prescinds from all that, and it is administered by persons who don't have a personal stake in the events being alleged. Because otherwise, by definition, if it's being administered by someone who's got a stake in the matter, then that by definition is not justice. That's a conflict of interest, as we call it now. So in a sense, that perhaps undermines the idea, this idea that anger is an appropriate motivation for administering justice. In a sense, it's an absolutely inappropriate motivation, for this reason, that it's driven by something other than objective consideration of the issues.
Yeah, the whole thing of philosophy of law is a whole thing in itself, isn't it? The whole operation of law. But may I draw attention before we move on to the next section? In the notes at the bottom of page 411, he does. Can I just read a couple of sentences here? I'd just like to get your views on this, because he's talking about, she's describing the way Seneca describes how anger takes, how it happens. Can I just read a couple of sentences? So Seneca asserts that anger requires assent, though he agrees that the mere species may provoke certain bodily responses, because they say there's so many different species of anger, right? So, trembling, pallor, tears, sighing, etc. But these are not passions, and they do not have the connections to action that passions do. And Seneca divides anger into 3 stages. 1, a non-voluntary movement, so that first bodily reflex, which follows directly on the species and precedes assent. And then 2, a movement that is voluntary, but not stubborn, which consists in the judgment, assent to the species. For example, it is right to take revenge, that's our assent to at that point. And then 3, an already controlling motion that does not want to take revenge if it is right, but in any way at all, and conquers reason. So the second stage is already anger, and is what a wise man must not have. The second stage will lead automatically to the third, unless some countervailing reason enters to stop it. And the 2 stages are distinguished to show that the judgments in which anger consists can be modified by judgment, but not once things have gone too far. I just thought it was a really good summary there,
Absolutely, Jodie, and thank you for bringing it to our attention, because I'd kind of skimmed over that. But in a sense, well, maybe that should have been in the actual text rather than in the footnotes. It kind of seems pretty key.
It is key. I thought it was quite key. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because later on, she really tries to pull apart this second stage. This what happens in that second stage and how to avoid it. Yeah.
A lot of these footnotes, like that one, and also all that talk about the tripartite soul, which got a footnote, for example. They are the kind of footnotes that Margaret Graver expands upon in that book, Stoicism and Emotion. So she kind of gets into a lot of those footnotes and looks at a bit of the background behind them. So it's definitely a nice follow-up read to this.
Yeah.
And obviously what you're talking about is the first part is considered the first movements, right? The proto-passions. Yeah.
Because we'll get to it, but that the idea that you can still be quite calm, and your actions might not appear passionate, but you are still acting in an angry way from what your actions actually do in terms of taking revenge in a calm way.
But I think it's really interesting if you watch yourself. If you read this theory and then watch yourself, you'll notice that before you have some sort of cognitive propositional content in the mind, you do experience hot flushes and things like that. I think the point is, and it's a bit like I was saying about that neuropsychologist woman, is we don't yet have to call it anger, and we don't have to act as if it is. We might just say, oh, that was weird. That's a warning. Here we go. My body is attempting to reach out impulsively. But now I formulate the proposition that fits that particular movement, and that is, oh, I desire to lash out at this person. Oh, I better rein this in now. You know, that's the kind of thing. I think it's a really wonderfully true, like just from your own, what's the word? Experiential observation. That's the kind of thing that goes into emotion. Emotion just doesn't spring out of thin air, out of the void. There's stuff that happens that gets you there. Yeah. But once you get to the stage, once you've assented to it, we know, again, the Chrysipian view is that as soon as you make that ascent, the judgment is already the emotion. It's identical to it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just reminded of, I mean, it's a bit of a digression, but if you read cases of horrendous honor killing, for example, or I don't know if that's the current term du jour, but cases where a male family member has murdered a female family member, there's a cognitive element to that. There's always a stated reason, and the reason is something like she went out wearing inadequate clothing and that I couldn't stand for that, or it was a disgrace on the family. There is a cognitive judgment in the background that justifies the action taken. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously, if it was possible to adjust the cognitive process, and dispute the arguments involved, then maybe there'd be a chance of preventing the horrendous outcomes of that kind of anger.
Yeah, definitely. And Margaret Graver again expands on the source of these false beliefs. If they don't come from nature, so where do they come from?
And she says from tradition. From tradition and from society, you know.
She talks about a twofold cause. So on the one hand, it's the appearance of things because they seem to suggest X, Y, and Z. And on the other hand, yeah, you're right, it's false teaching. It's spread by culture and by our friends and families and relatives and education systems and politics and things like that. And I think that's really, really interesting. So the example Judith just gave, honor killings, they're not common in our culture, you know. If my daughter went out wearing inappropriate clothes, I probably wouldn't know they were inappropriate. But if I was from a very traditional culture, I might go, oh my God, I'm going to hang myself if you go out like that, because I've been taught that's just absolutely catastrophically, no, you can't. That cannot be done. That's how powerful they can be too. Remember, we were talking about Schopenhauer. The human animal, he says, is the only creature that can, through its beliefs, compound upon its own sorrows so much that it can take its own life. And that's what we do with the rational part in us. It creates the world for us. It's incredible. Who's doing the next part?
Do you want to do it, Courtney? Have you got?
I think you're doing it, Courtney.
Oh, have I segued into it? Have I? Okay, this is where you guys will find out that I've got inadequate notes. Let's have a look. Part 4. These are the central arguments, the ones you just gave. How effective are they? There are some evident problems. First, Seneca's motivational arguments rely heavily on the claim that the non-angry person will be able to have the same reasons for action as the angry person. Okay. In such passages, she's talking about, he will respond to injury by inflicting merited punishments, including punishments that cause the death of the offender. So in these sort of passages, Seneca might be read as saying that the difference between the angry person and the non-angry person is a non-cognitive difference. They both have the same reasons and judgments, but one has a kind of furious, passionate motivation that the other does not. This, however, cannot be a correct interpretation if Seneca is consistent, for it is, of course, his view that anger is a certain kind of judgment, that its furious impetus is the impetus of a type of reasoning about externals. So the difference between the two people must, after all, be a difference in judgments. And that's something that we've sort of discussed in pretty good detail. So what are the judgments of the good person then? It would appear that they include the following. A deliberate and culpable wrong has been done to someone who is important to me, someone whom I am obliged to protect. This person ought to be punished, ought to suffer for what he has done. But what then are the judgments of the angry person? Again, they seem to include the belief that deliberate wrong has been committed, that the wrong is in some way important, and that it will be good for vengeance to come to the wrongdoer. These judgments, it appears from both Seneca's account and other Stoic accounts, are sufficient for anger. Indeed, on the Chrysippeian view, which Seneca accepts, they are what anger is. But then if the good person really has these judgments, he is angry, whether he foams at the mouth and rolls his eyes or not. The measured and diligent pursuit of revenge described here looks precisely like a type of anger. A type, moreover, that may jeopardize Seneca's attempt to link anger to excess and lack of control. If, on the other hand, a good person does not really have the judgments characteristic of the angry person, then it seems to be still an open question whether and to what degree he will pursue the offender and take risks to protect his own. And that's what we were talking about before regarding justice. So she's kind of really exploring the complexity here. Do you guys have any views on that?
Yeah, I thought that was an excellent summary she's given there of some of the processes going on. And yeah, this idea that if the good person really has these judgments, he's angry whether he foams at the mouth and rolls his eyes or not. So it's not necessarily to do with external manifestation of the emotion. It's what's going on inside. So that's, yeah, really, really key, I guess. And that's why this radical therapy is required.
Yeah. And then she goes on, right, and says that I guess she's sort of taking that view that if a person is just following justice for justice sake, she says, and making the good man look like a more evidently Stoic figure, a figure who believes in his heart that family ties are without true worth and that the only thing of real importance is virtue, a figure who goes through the motions of the conventionally appropriate action like a play actor, without really deep commitment to the issues at stake, simply carrying out his role in the overall scheme of things, such a person will really be different in judgments from the ordinary Roman. He will, it seems, really be able to take revenge without anger. I guess that's all very interesting. It makes some very interesting points. And she compares this, say, to Wiesel, the young child, Wiesel's American soldier. There was something in the behavior of the American soldier, his cursing and shouting when he witnessed, what had happened in the Nazi death camps, that reminded Wiesel that, humanity had returned. He also, this is Wiesel, we can add, the soldier aligned himself with a kind of optimism for humanity more generally, for his outrage expressed the judgment that things need not be this way, that one must expect better of human beings. So she seems to be saying that it seems like an appropriate reaction to have when things are not the way they ought to be. When they've gone so far wrong, then shouldn't we cry out? Shouldn't we be outraged at certain things? But apparently the Stoic is not. The Stoic is able to Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's an interesting tension that she's exploring there. What does she say next? According to Seneca, the the more appropriate Stoic actor would be moved to pursue the offender, but what in his heart would he think? If he was a true Stoic, he will think that none of this matters very much anyway, that such evils are bound to come about in human life, that it's all what one should expect. This being the case, it's not worth his while to get very upset about it and cry out. If he pursued the Nazis on the battlefield or in the law courts, it will be not because he attaches any intrinsic value to the righting of these wrongs, but because he has come to believe that this is what the universe requires of him right now. But why, one might inquire, does the universe require it if it is of no true importance? And might the person who believes it has no true importance not be likely to waver concerning what the universe actually requires, especially in the vindication of the wronged requires prolonged if the vindication of the wronged requires prolonged labor and risk. So she's raising these interesting problems, and it seems that part of the Greek Stoic solution is to take a very strict side with the law, right? And to enforce the law extremely harshly without any wavering. There can be no sort of kind of emotion involved whatsoever. What does she say next? If Seneca had produced the orthodox Stoic reply, would it have solved his problem? So he's doing something a little bit different. The Stoic, he would say, allows that all these items have, in a certain sense, worth, and are appropriately preferred on account of their relation to one's natural constitution. But the kind of worth they must, as we recall, be carefully circumscribed. They do not have a worth that is either necessary for or a part of one's own eudaimonia. Without them, one's life is still complete. One will therefore have no reason for grief at damage to them, or for fear at a threat, nor is the worth in any sense comparable to or commensurable with the worth of one's virtue. So again, the Stoic way of looking at things is to see one's relationships with loved ones as good to a certain extent, right? They serve some natural role in relation to our own constitution. But on the other hand, they aren't necessary for they can never be considered true goods like virtue can be. I guess if you pull it apart like this, it creates, you can see the inner tension that comes up in Stoicism when we're talking about these sorts of things.
Yeah, look, just to interject, I suppose, in a sense, she's kind of coming at this from a particular angle, and the particular angle is, and the subtext is, if it had been down to the Stoics, would we have done anything about the Nazi death camps? I mean, that's kind of the subtext, right? And in a sense, well, that's kind of an ahistorical perspective. That's one thing to be said. But the other thing to be said is there were injustices in the ancient world that Stoics were totally opposed to, and that's why so many of them finished up executed, exiled, and otherwise got out of the way. So in a sense, I think she's glossing over that aspect, that the Stoics were not, they weren't turning a blind eye to injustice on a regular basis, I suppose, is what I would say. So I think that's important to bear in mind in this passage.
I think she's actually setting up her big tour de force at the end of the section, which is to bring in the medical analogy again and talk about the doctrines part. So she's really setting us up to go, oh yeah, Stoics, Stoics don't, they're not attached to the outcome and blah blah blah, and they're not, you know, it's all preferred, it's all indifferent, you know, why it's all external, why would they even be concerned, you know? But so she's cleverly sort of just steering us to this final part where she's resolving it, where, you know, in the way that Seneca explains.
All right, so jumping into that part then, yep, Seneca has an answer to that problem, sure. So the answer makes use of the medical analogy, as you're saying, Judy. The good man is concerned about his fellow citizens in the manner of a doctor. When he administers a punishment for wrongdoing, he does so not because he himself takes any personal interest in the infliction of pain, but in order to improve the offender. So on all these things, he looks as benignly as a doctor on his patients, believing that it is better by far to cure a wrong than to avenge it. In public, this means that he will use all the conventional forms of punishment, but without the inner pain of being personally wronged, and without any eager desire for the sufferings of the wrongdoer. For he does not harm, but he administers medical treatment in the guise of harming. Just as some bodily afflictions respond to a gentle alteration in daily regimen, so too the character of some offenders can be treated by rather gentle words. If this does not work, he will employ harsher speech, which warns and reproves. Finally, he moves to punishments, first light and reversible, then for the most recalcitrant, the deepest wrongs, the penalty of death. This is a good response for the Stoic to make to our problem, for it shows a way in which the non-angry person can still care intensely about humanity and be motivated on its behalf while failing to share the judgments of that angry person. So yeah, that's an interesting way out of it, right? Just as you say, rather than having this desire to inflict pain on others, we have instead something that comes from the medical analogy, a desire to cure the sick.
Sorry, just to interrupt, that goes back to Gorgias, and we see it also later in Boethius.
Yes. The Stoic views the punishment as justified, not on account of the importance of the wrong done, but on account of the pain and injustice suffered by the victim. And certainly not because he cares about what has happened in any personal way, but solely on account of the well-being of the offender. And Seneca takes this to a very extreme point, defending even capital punishment on the grounds that death is in some cases a good for the person who dies. Yeah.
That's problematic for me in a sense. She does come back to that idea of the death penalty later in the chapter again. But I sort of got to that point and sort of went, oh, really? Because I hadn't read around that enough to understand it. Do you either of you any knowledge to maybe extend that? Seneca argues that the death penalty is in some cases a good for the person who dies.
It seemed to be a view that Socrates held too. I think you mentioned Gorgias there, Judith, and I remember him talking about that it was right for a person to suffer as a way of atoning for the wrongs they'd done in order to pay back what they had taken or whatever. And it seemed to go to that extent if necessary. So it's obviously quite an old view. And Socrates was, I imagine, coming from a similar kind of medical kind of point of view. It was good for the soul. Yeah, it's hard for us to imagine that these days. We tend to think that we like the Socratic element where we say people have been ignorant and so we need to educate them, and that it ought to be done gently tends to be the more contemporary method. In fact, there's a lot of talk, for example, I don't know how true it is, but apparently there's evidence to suggest that those prisons in certain countries that are non-punitive and have a more of a kind of educative or anyway, a gentle atmosphere and environment tends to reduce recidivism, or has at least as good rates. I think they say it has better rates of non-recidivism than than prisons that are punitive. So apparently there's evidence to suggest that that's the case, which kind of doesn't really go well with the Stoic argument in this situation, because we're being told here that a harsh penalty is what a recalcitrant offender needs. But then again, maybe it's contextual. Maybe if you get a kid and he keeps doing the wrong thing and you thump him a couple of times, he's going to stop doing it. So who knows?
I think it's a bit contextual, because essentially just about everything in antiquity and pretty much up to about the 1790s was punished with the death penalty. So yeah, I think it's contextual. I think we need to look at the individual situation of each criminal justice system.
The next section, 418, you're on, I think now, about the this. See, now she does another little twist here on 4. Sorry, go on, Courtney.
No, you're right. Which bit grabbed your attention?
She does another little somersault here. She's going to bring up the idea of don't we, at the top of 418, but don't we want to acknowledge the suffering of the wronged? So now she's going to bring us back to the victims. Yeah, sorry, go on. You do it. You're right.
No, you're right. Don't we want a response that acknowledges one's own fellow feeling with the sufferer? Because that intuitively seems to make sense to us. One's own deep implication in the lives and vulnerabilities of others. And I must admit, don't we all feel like that when we hear on the news that some terrible wrong is being perpetrated to someone? We have it. Oh, well, I shouldn't say we. I have a tendency to feel for them and almost imagine getting vengeance on their behalf at times that feels appropriate. And as we reflect in this way, well, no, she says, rather than that, what about the somewhat detached and superior response of the Stoic doctor? As we reflect on this, we might even begin to lose hold of the conception of merited punishment itself. For if the sufferings of the victim are of no real importance in the overall scheme of things, then the act that caused them seems to lose its serious badness. The good person thinks of the events of fortune as things that merely graze the surface of his skin. But how bad can it be to graze the surface of someone else's skin? And if the offender's act is not serious, for what disease then is the medicine of punishment being meted out? Seneca, to some extent, conceals these problems, she says, especially in the first book. But they are always there beneath the surface of the argument, and if he cannot resolve them, he cannot in the end convince an interlocutor who has Roman and Aristotelian intuitions. A second and closely related problem arises if we consider the argument from excess. One of Seneca's key claims in his debate with the Aristotelian is that anger cannot reliably stop short of excess and cruelty. She sort of says, but is that so? When we considered the person avenging his father and mother, we found that it was very difficult to distinguish an angry person from the non-angry person that Seneca depicts by referring simply to Seneca's official account of anger in terms of judgment. It seems perfectly possible to have all the requisite judgments and still pursue one's duties in a measured way. Seneca, however, repeatedly denies this possibility and more or less defines anger in terms of its excessive propensities. If it listens to reason and follows where reason leads, then it is no longer anger, whose peculiar property is obstinate rebellion. Okay. So she kind of concludes here that what right does Seneca declare that a proprium of anger is resistance to reason, given that he has defined it in terms of belief alone? By what right does he describe it using images that connote excess and cruelty when all his argument has yet established is that it is a certain sort of judgment? There is, right at the end there, she says, there is, however, more to be said than this on Seneca's behalf, for an argument that we have not yet considered will shed considerable light on these two objections and their force, showing the relative detachment of the Stoic in a more attractive light. So I think in part what's going on here is it seems like there are some very real tensions in the original Greek Stoic perspective that she's really trying to draw out here, and that Seneca has his own way of dealing with them, and this is where he brings mercy into the picture. Yeah. So who wants to do the next part?
Jodie, do you want to go ahead? You're on mute, Jodie.
Yeah, that's better. That's better. All right, so we'll jump into 5. You're happy then for me to do 5? Okay. I put in down here too, notes in the bottom of page 419. Anger becomes ungovernable and cruel by frequent exercise. Seneca wishes to stress both that anger can be removed by reasoning and that it is terribly difficult to do this once it takes root in the soul, and its impetus is difficult to check. So that idea of the stubbornness of it once it gets into that third stage. Part 5, 419, tension between human being and human nature. So he's going to bring up in 420 that Seneca denies that there is an innate and irremediable aggressive instinct in human nature, most alien to the human being. I've got in quotation marks. It can be removed by continual reflective practice. So here's his appeal to us in terms of practical ways to overcome it. His injunction is to cultivate humanity. He also dwells on the pervasiveness of vice, especially of aggression, and the desire to inflict harm on others. The person who pardons wrong is giving indulgence to the human species. We are all bad, he says. The wise person is not surprised at the omnipresence of aggression and injustice, since he has examined thoroughly the circumstances of human life. And among the other difficult circumstances of human life is this one: confused and blurred thinking, and not so much the necessity of erring as the love of erring. So we're on to page 421. I've got again to the notes here. Nature supports the growth of vices, of aggression and competitiveness. It is the condition that prompts vice. I don't know what context that was in. I just wrote it out of the notes there at the bottom of page 421. I thought it was an interesting observation. Nature supports the growth of vices, of aggression and competitiveness. It is the condition that prompts vice. I don't know what that was about. Is that saying that nature is behind the motivation to these things?
Look, it's a difficult point, Jodie. I think you're right to draw attention to it, and it definitely is a tension. And again, this is something that kind of probably would have benefited from being in the main text rather than footnotes. But I mean, there's definitely a tension here around the Stoic belief that everybody basically and naturally is well disposed to their fellow human beings. But on the other hand, what do we see around us all the time? We see arguments, we see rivalries, we see feuds, we see violence. And so there is definitely a tension around how they're trying to explain that. And I think the claim vitiam natura defendit is very curiously, but she defends it and said, or she reads it as saying that there's the claim that nature, i.e. the conditio, the way we find ourselves in the world, supports the growth of vices and aggression and competitiveness. So yeah, I definitely think there's a big tension here, and possibly because she wasn't in a position to address that in its entirety because of space. But yeah, I think it remains an issue for the Stoics to suggest both that naturally we are all predisposed to fellow feeling and community, but on the other hand, society leads us to rivalry, feuding, and and vice, essentially. So yeah, there's definitely a tension there, and I guess possibly she felt that was probably another book in the making, and she couldn't possibly complete her treatment of it, and so that's why it's in the footnote.
Yes.
She expands it a bit there, doesn't she? She says human beings do not come into the world with evil or aggressive instincts. On the contrary, their initial impulses love and accord. But the world in which they come is a rough place that confronts them with threats to their safety on every side. And like Margaret Graver talks about, there's a twofold cause. There's, on the one hand, the appearance of things, and that's kind of that side of it, is that it looks like that we can be harmed. It looks like that it matters really gravely whether or not we get the food or not when it's in short supply. But she's saying the Stoics think, of course, that we've been misled by the appearance of things, because what's actually important is the correct use of reason in the first place. So it just, aggression grows out of our own constitution, but in response to the scarcity of things in the world. So she says here, aggression grows not inside our nature, but out of an interaction between nature and conditions that is likely to be universal. And here's the bit where it invokes the correct use of reason, unless and until philosophical education removes the darkness from human thought.
Yeah. So yeah, it's about the battle for resources can lead to vice. Yeah. All right, I better keep going. 421, I think still. Human beings' initial impulses are those of love. Oh, I think you just talked about that, Courtney. Sorry. Of love and concord, but the world is a rough place that confronts them with threats to their safety. Yep, on every side. Sorry, yeah, you just did all that. I'll try and skip past their attachment to the world will lead to aggression.
The reason I brought that up is because that's where your footnote comes in.
Yeah, exactly. For when goods are in short supply, people are attached to them and fight one another for them. Aggression is, the origin of vice. It's the desire for that which we do not have. Okay, I better try and move forward. These arguments are very close to those of Lucretius. She does make note of as well. Life, if we attach ourselves to it, alienates us from our own humanity. So a baby, soft and mild, loves its parents, but this invariably turns to hardness. A life itself turns the child in time against itself and the roots of its bonds to others. We are combatants, gladiators, vicious monsters we are. We see injustice and aggression as important, bad things to get upset about, so we never cease to be angry. So this idea that we can just sort of spiral out of control, we just, for everything we see will upset us. The wise person will never cease to be angry if he once begins, so for everything is full of crime and vice. Innocence is non-existent. Seneca lists the recent offences in Rome to illustrate his point here. And he says that if the wise man is to be as angry as the baseness of the crimes demands, he must not only be angry, he must go mad. So for a person who notes and reacts to every injustice must, in reacting to them all with anger, become, in the end, similar to the raging and furious people against whom he reacts. Anger hardens the spirit and turns it against the humanity it sees. And so on 423, examples given are of Sulla, Caligula. Oh, did you already do this, Judith? Did you already say these examples?
I think it came up earlier.
Yeah, it did.
But so that point you're making there, it's true, isn't it? As a counter example to what we've been talking about, if the wise Stoic person, like you say, responds to every injustice that he sees following the full extent of the law, he'd have to kill everybody. And that's not a useful solution, So he would be just as bad as the people that he has come to blame.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I think this is a really good part of the argument, personally. This really makes sense to me.
And I
A good
think famously this comes up in some of the later Christian inquisitions, in that is they would just round up the village, and apparently, whether it's true or not, there was one or two cases where they'd say, kill them all, let God sort them out, you know, because it didn't matter if you broke a few eggs to make an omelette, apparently. You
Yeah,
know,
well, that's right.
everybody's a sinner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think it's a powerful argument that if we're going to get angry about stuff, well, there's plenty of stuff to get angry about, and no natural limit ultimately.
Yeah. All right, 423 I'm up to. A good example of Plato is given, who turns punishment of a slave over to another because he himself feels angry. Anger, however justified, turns us against the face of our humanity. If we only see disgusting beasts, we won't treat them as human beings. This hardening against the group is a first step towards brutality, breaking the human compact. The Stoic injunction to withhold ourselves from anger seems not so much a way of detaching us from human needs and the importance of human safety, but as a strategy to solidify our underlying bonds and our fellow human beings, with our fellow human beings, to preserve something of the child's natural, open, and loving demeanor towards others, something of the nature to which human beings are born before they see the world. Before they see the world. Oh dear.
But this is true, right?
Yeah.
If aggression is not innate and not part of nature, then anything that leads to a breakdown in social cohesion is anti-human nature. So when we see things like violence and aggression, and even the kind of things she's saying here, the kind of quiet, rational, sticking to the law, yet meting out this punishment that extinguishes life, even that would look like a form of a kind of excess, because it leads to a breakdown of social cohesion. So yeah, I think that really grounds the argument that aggression is not part of human nature. We are made to develop social accords with each other and social cohesion, and anything counter to that is vice, really.
So the Stoic advice, such as advice to meditate on future, Stoic advice, such as advice to meditate on future evils, the advice not to consider injuries as terribly important, the advice to take up a medical attitude to the wrongdoer, are not strategies of insulation and detachment from others, but as necessary tools towards a truly humane and gentle public life. Seneca does not deny the importance of externals, the popular beliefs of the family and city, the values of family and city, but he shows that a policy of detachment from that importance is a wise policy. Anger sets us over against the one who has done wrong. This person is beneath me, is in quotes here, and also in quotes, this person is not really human. So therefore, anger contains an excessive love and exaltation of oneself. Yeah, so this idea that, anger is about elevating the importance of self, in a sense, none of us is without fault. Anger arises from, well, I did nothing wrong. They did something wrong. I didn't do something, they're the one that did it wrong, so the placing of the self in this self-righteous position. The fair judge examines the wrongdoing of others along with a searching, critical scrutiny of himself, searching out the pervasive roots of wrongdoing in both self and others. And also one can remain gentle towards oneself rather than violent towards one's own desires. So that softness to self is important as well, In book 3, Seneca is showing us that anger dwells among us and our own, using himself as an exemplum, based on searching self-inspection and medical gentleness to both self and others. he undergoes a nightly review of the day. He measures his deeds and words with patience and particularity. So he passes over nothing and pardons himself. Novatus will consider himself as a person with rich inner depths, studying himself in the patient light of medical reason. I'm on 425, by the way. He will moderate his rage towards people and their injustices and intensify his commitment to human solidarity and mutual aid.
You know, parts of that are really reminiscent, aren't they, of the early church, or
Oh,
before
very
the
much
church?
so.
Because
Yeah.
you've got an Old Testament view that, people need to be punished according to the law, no exceptions. And then someone comes along and says, well, an eye for an eye will make the whole world blind. So we need to introduce some measure of mercy. And the reasoning is really sound, because I too am a sinner. I too am not perfect. I too have done the wrong thing. And in fact, that's part of the therapy he's saying. He's saying, instead of taking that morally righteous position, it's recognition that ignorance is ubiquitous. It's so easy to get caught off guard by appearances. I do it all the time. I'm in the same situation as these people that I'm condemning, so I ought to show them the mercy that I ought to show myself. And there's even this form of confession going on. There's this nightly retreat into oneself where one examines himself. So yeah, I think that's quite. I wonder how much the Christians looked at all that and thought, oh, take some of those ideas. Thank you, Mr. Seneca.
Yeah, 100%. And also, I'd point to the English common law tradition, where I think it was Hale who enunciated it, was the idea that, and this is so profound and so far-reaching, right? The idea that it's better for 10 guilty people to go unpunished than for one innocent person to be scapegoated, essentially. It's like, the human desire to scapegoat someone for some wrong is so strong that we are so bound to resist it, that it is better that we let 10 people who probably did it go free than to scapegoat the person who just happened to be there in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think that's such an amazing principle. But the sort of the germ of it is right here in this Stoic idea that we are, it's better to be lenient in our judgment rather than vengeful and turning our aggression onto any object that might be around.
Do you feel that this might be what you were talking about earlier, where Seneca might not be the purest in terms of the early Greek Stoa, where they had maybe a more disciplined and stern approach to such things, and Seneca has, or am I on the wrong track there?
No, I was just thinking that right now. I was wondering, to what degree is Seneca an innovator here? And I mean, I don't know the answer to it. Maybe before this, who knows? Maybe there was a stricter, more Old Testament version of the law, so to speak. And we see that Seneca's got different influences. She mentions that his teacher, Sextius, was given to Pythagoreanism or something.
Yeah.
And she said, in fact, that idea of confession, that nightly meditation, has more of a Pythagorean kind of connection to it than a traditionally Stoic one. So we might see that Seneca, in his interest to doing therapy, is picking more broadly from other traditions. I don't know. That would be interesting to know more about.
Yeah,
well, we know he was ready to take useful things from the Epicurean tradition. So yeah, I'd say that's possibly the case. Yeah, I'm happy to go on with 6 if we're happy to do that.
And there's just that one last sentence that that I on 426 that I wrote down here. Looking into oneself is an act of public courage and of humanity. I just thought that was a nice way to finish the section that she put there. That it's an action Oh, have I frozen?
Yeah, you have.
Oh, that's better.
Yeah,
that
you're back.
yeah, that looking into oneself is an act of public courage. So that linking of self to the broader, community.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because, again, to reiterate, Seneca had lived through Nero's reign, or most of it, and had a sense of these being kind of, particularly graphic events in human history, which they were. Nero is still a byword for cruelty and vengefulness. So that's where he's coming from, in a sense. Although I'm not quite sure around the timing of, or the supposed dating of De Ira, but let's just say it was written with the full understanding of Roman imperial arbitrary power in mind. I mean, that's obviously got to be in the background. All right, so section 6. And here Nussbaum reverts to the evidence from the very earliest of the Stoa. But these, of course, are just, isolated, usually maxims or aphorisms, so we've got to be aware of that. All wise men are severe, austeroi in Greek. They never permit their soul to give way or to be caught by any pleasure or pain. And that's from Clement. Now, remember, we've got to remember that Clement is a Christian. He's got a different agenda. So, they've got to take it with a grain of salt. But, if we're to take it at face value, this hardness cordons them off from any yielding response to the defects of another. The wise man does not forgive those who err, and he never waives the punishment required in the law. Okay, so where does that leave us? An unyielding judge who does exactly what strict legal justice requires rejects the idea of epieikeia, the idea that is that one might waive strict punishment as a result of a concrete understanding of a particular case. So again, we've got to be aware of what Nussbaum's doing here. She's reverting to the very earliest fragments and kind of traces of the early Stoa. And maybe it's a bit of a straw man, to be honest, about the strictness of the early Stoa. But let's just go on. And she points to a deep tension here. On the one hand, the Stoics are committed to the analogy around medical therapy. On the other hand, the Aristotelian tradition links this medical model with a strong commitment to epieikeia in public life. And that's, in around good judgment, going beyond the generality of the law. It is, says Aristotle, equitable epieikeis to forgive human things. So where does that leave us? She thinks that Seneca, and we're going on to page 427 here, is more consistent than the Greek Stoics, allowing his adherence to the medical way of looking at human defects to carry him away from the harsh rigor, as she has portrayed it, of the Stoic wise men and towards the Aristotelian tradition of epieikeia. So yeah, I mean, that's got plausibility. As we know, Seneca was happy to entertain concepts from other schools. So that adds up.
It just gave me an idea too for a shirt. Like I always come up with these ideas for like philosophical t-shirts. And I could imagine, Bruce Willis's character from what's that movie?
Die Hard. No.
Die Hard. And it's sort of like you could have it something like a caption saying John McClane, Aristotelian, epikeia, motherfucker. Because it sounds like yippee-ki-yay. Anyway.
Yeah, but the problem is no one would understand it, Courtney, and they'd be peering at your chest in the supermarket queue, and it'd be like a bit weird. And where do you go from there, But go ahead, make the t-shirt.
That's right. I'll work on it.
So, and here she brings in, and it's perhaps a little contrived, but what she's doing is bringing us around to Senecan Clementia. Senecan Clementia does not fail to judge vice that is constantly stressed in the De Clementia as here. Mercy is not acquittal, but looking at oneself and the circumstances of humanity, one comes to understand how such things have happened, and this medical understanding leads to mercy. Now, I'll just step aside to say there's a whole literature around the Roman concept of clementia, when it came in. Did it come in because of Augustus? Did he kind of invent it as a policy position because he failed to execute all of his political allies? He called it political, allies and then enemies, and he called it clementia. Is that what's going on there? So yeah, let's just say that clementia has a bit of a colorful history. So as she says, mercy clementia is even defined in a manner that makes this difference from Greek Stoic harshness evident. For it is an inclination of the soul to mildness in exacting penalties, and also that which turns its course away, this side of that which could be justly determined. Now, I'm just looking at that line and thinking, oh my goodness, I'm trying to imagine the Latin in that very complex sentence. It would have been just amazing. So this is virtuoso Seneca. The Greek Stoic soul, by contrast, never bends aside, never inclines away from hardness. Yeah, maybe. And given that the opposite of mercy is cruelty, and that cruelty is a reflex of anger, we can also say that mercy is opposed at one and the same time both to strictness in exacting penalties and also to anger, as if that strictness does indeed lie very close to anger in the heart. As Seneca says, it is a fault to punish a fault in full. Culpa est tortam persequi culpam. And that's from Seneca, De Clementia 2:7. And so she allows, she's allowed here to conclude that the politics of the De Ira is a politics of mercy and of gradualism. And so we've gone.
I like that idea. I actually looked up gradualism because I'd never heard of it. And I thought, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's kind of a nice view. So it's rather than a radical, ideal kind of sudden changing of political the situation, it's much more, I guess, would you say it's, I wonder if you'd call it practical, but it's definitely a lot more humanitarian, isn't it? It's that slow change, accepting that people aren't going to change suddenly, all of a sudden. They need time to adjust. They need to be re-educated. It's a gentle kind of ongoing process. I must admit, I don't know enough about the background here, but she makes Seneca seem like a wonderful politician at the very least, right?
Yeah, 100%. And of course, that's partly what he did in La Clementia. I mean, imagine trying to negotiate Nero and Agrippina and then just Nero all the time. I mean, it was insane. And yet he did construct this this coherent position around tolerance, really. I mean, that's what it came to be called later in political history, is toleration or tolerance, is not erring on the side of execution and torture and exile and brutality, but erring on the side of turning a blind eye or being lenient or whatever. And it's a very important political principle, and obviously had resonance down the ages. Seneca reminds Novatus that excessively high expectations and utopian ambitions are all too often a recipe for rage. And in Book 330, his diagnosis of the murder of Julius Caesar by his associates. The hope of a complete change in the human being and in human social life may have been the force behind the famous radical utopian works of Greek Stoic political theory, the Politeia of Zeno and Chrysippus. But these works did indeed imagine a city, all of whose citizens were virtuous. And it imagined the removal of many of the constraints that the absence of virtue now makes necessary in human life. But, that's the Greeks. The Romans were not utopians. None of the Romans were utopians. Seneca's more cautious and humane approach insists that we cannot and should not expect the leaky vessel of human life to be made anew. Instead, we patch it and keep it going as best we can, working patiently each day for each day's small improvement. Neither disgusted nor discouraged if the task proves as difficult as human life is. And just to sidebar here, that's absolutely exactly the same as Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations. He's there dealing on a daily basis with the intractable problems of politics and of human life and of human personalities and agendas and rivalries and all that. That's what's involved. The Romans had no illusions about that, whether or not the heads of the philosophical schools in Athens did. The Romans had no illusions about that.
And I heard something on the radio the other day too. It got me thinking about this. Just because it's a sort of contemporary debate, Amanda Vanstone has a radio program, and she was talking to someone who was from some government agency who was talking about basically domestic violence and that. And she was saying, when I was in politics, and she was there for 20 years or whatever, she said they threw countless amount of monies basically at prevention programs for domestic violence, and it hadn't had a single kind of iota of effect, kind of stuff. And the academic was saying, well, what are you saying, that we shouldn't even try? And she was like, no, well, obviously I'm just saying it doesn't work, so I don't know what we should do. But here, this is what you see throughout history is politicians, Seneca, people, like even people like Marcus Aurelius, like you say, understanding that it's really difficult to make these sort of changes, and you definitely can't do it suddenly. So all you can do is gradually chip away at this monumental resistance that appears in human behavior. But this optimistic view that you see here is that it's not even integral to human behavior. It's not natural to human behavior. It's just the way things appear to us to be. And we constantly need to be reminded. But the last thing we should do is abandon people to that appearance and to give up on them, because at least some people know that we could be better if we applied ourselves. And anyway,
100%. I'm totally around. Let's bring de ira, both in Seneca's formulation and in Plutarch's, back into the schools, right? Get young people thinking around why it is that they react or they overreact to minor issues. It's basic. It's not rocket science, right? It is not rocket science. It is something that we could do, and this is why it's so frustrating that, as you say, billions of dollars are spent to do what in terms of family violence. Well, actually, we could do something around young people and their reactions to events. We could do that. We could do it with Stoicism. We could do it with Seneca and Plutarch. And why are we not doing it? Yeah, it's something that I think is actually practicable in a school context, and that's where it would have the most impact. And that's where we're not doing it for whatever reason.
Yeah,
anyway, let's just go back to Nussbaum. As doctors of ourselves, doctors of human life, we try quite simply to fill the short space of our years with as much goodness as possible and as little rage, including and especially rage against rage itself. That's another profound observation. So we're on to page 429. Seneca concludes his argument for mercy by reminding Novatus that there is simply too little time in human life to waste it on anger. That's another argument, that I think could impact young people when you present it to them. I mean, notoriously, young people don't focus on the limited time remaining to them, but I think it's still something that might have an impact. Soon we shall breathe our last. Meanwhile, while we endure, while we're among human beings, let us cultivate humanity. Let us be a cause of fear, of danger to no one. Let us despise harms, injustices, abuses, and taunts. It doesn't matter what that person said about you. It doesn't matter what you think that other person said about you. It doesn't matter. And bear with a large soul our brief inconveniences. While we look back, as they say, and turn around, death is upon us. Here the injunction is not to care for external happenings, and is the argument not as a way of detaching Novatus from the world and from ties to others, but as a strategy from humanitas, removing barriers that stand between oneself and one's fellow citizens. So is it just a strategy to keep the self pure from rage, or is it also the correct attitude to the offender? Well, it's kind of better both. She thinks that Seneca's argument it starts by insisting on the former, that's to do with self, but by the end of De Ira and in the entirety of De Clementia, he endorses the latter view around others. It is appropriate to judge, to blame, to convict in law, but it's also appropriate to think of the whole course of a human life and of the fact that even the most heinous wrongs are the products of not an initially evil will, but of a network of circumstances, psychological, social, and natural. And of course, that's what we expect judges in the criminal justice system to take account of. You know, that's what we pay them for, right? Is to take account of all these factors. When one sees all this, mercy is not just prudent, it is just. Epieikeia is as correct situational perception, leads to epieikeia as merciful mitigation.
Thank you, beautiful. I'm not doing 7 because I didn't make very good notes, and I don't like picking through the text. So do you want to do it, Jody or Judith?
I'm happy to do it if I don't freeze up. There's just that comment too, though, he made about the Stoic, the thing about the distinction is important between mercy and pity or compassion. Did you talk about that, Judith? The difference between...
I haven't mentioned that, no.
Yeah, because acknowledgement of one's own weakness and vulnerability is forbidden, the Stoic, was the point made there, as seen as a form of depression, a yielding to fortune. So Nussbaum sees this as a weakness in Stoic political theory, she says. I just thought I'd draw attention to that little bit there on 428.
So can you remind me where that is, 428?
Down the bottom of 428.
Okay, so I will say that Nussbaum has been critiqued, and there is a body of scholarship disputing this with Nussbaum. I'll just say that.
Oh, okay. Rightio. And okay, on to 7. Nussbaum offers a critique in this section of De Ira and De Clementia, starting by drawing attention to the large amount of violent punishment that is allowed and fostered in the name of mercy, and the medical defense of capital punishment as good for the person who dies. So, for example, Plato didn't beat his slave. He gave the job to Speusippus. It could be seen that Seneca condones much that should not have been accepted. So this is her critique. The general pessimism about human behavior and advice to prepare oneself for the worst to avoid the surprise of anger when the worst does happen seems hostile to the cultivation of humanity, since they are preparations for tolerating what is worst in the human being. So what's she saying there? So she's saying that he's actually being too tolerant or something?
Yeah, I think she's pointing to cultural variation between what we consider appropriate and what he considers normal or tolerable. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's,
I think you're right. It's
a point around cultural expectations, really.
Yeah. So, but his strategies for preparation for the worst and focusing on the badness of human life are aimed not at making us callous towards evil, but at being patient in the fight against evil. It is better not to set one's expectations too high. With a Stoic view, one will patiently continue on a path of mercy to aid human beings, seeing them as struggling against the odds. 431, page 431. But then she asks, how far is the evil done by human beings to one another worth caring about? Seneca may not be fully consistent with orthodox Stoicism by allowing the events of the world to have weight and importance. Nussbaum sees it as a strategy of mildness rather than a dismissal of the real horror of the crime. And yet the Stoic To avoid anger, must cultivate a large degree of detachment, hardly compatible with the full acknowledgement of the suffering of victims. So she's coming back to that point again about the victims. Seneca suggests in 311 a deliberate avoidance of knowledge. So 432, page 432, this avoidance of knowledge. Don't be curious in the context of dealing with insults to oneself, really was what the context was when he said that. It was to avoid, so as to avoid anger, but it implies advice to refuse to be cognizant of evils that are all around one. So this idea of turning a blind eye, which is a cost to one's humanity. Can one fail to intervene on behalf of others because one has avoided knowledge of their plight? So yeah, she's sort of bringing us back to that idea of the Holocaust. You know, on the other hand, he wants to defend public courage and sacrifice. So in book one, we had given examples where it is important for a good person to get involved, pursue the offender, do justice to family love. In book 3, Seneca uses examples of horror inflicted by despotic rulers against the children of those who have caused a minor offence. So this is where he's really winding up at the end now, isn't he?
Yes. Sorry, just quickly, it is a really powerful tension. I mean, at least the way that Nussbaum presents it. So, on the one hand, and I can really see where she's coming from, actually, because, I'm interested in practicing with these sort of Stoic perspectives and working as a therapist. And I think you could make a case that it makes you pretty good at therapy because you can sit in the company of really terrible things and not be overwhelmed by them because you're very good at guarding what belongs to you. There becomes a distinction between you and the other, and you're very aware of that potential to empathize, and that's something that you don't do. So you can listen, and you can actually be really effective, actually, because you can listen very well, and you can feign a deep kind of sympathy. It's almost feigning because you're not letting yourself take on the pain of the other person. You're always very much saying, this belongs to me, this is me, that happened to them, that belongs to them, it has nothing to do with me. And so I can see how that tension plays out. I think it's really effective, though. It's a way to live in a world that's unpredictable, dangerous, and if you want to find the kind of virtue that the Stoics talk about and happiness, you need to find a radical technique like this to escape the vicissitudes of the external world. But it comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of having this healthy detachment from other people's suffering. And that means you have to reduce its effect on you by not buying into it, by not making yourself a part of their suffering. It didn't happen to you. And of course, the Stoic can withstand any suffering that happens to him also, because he likewise makes any kind of suffering, whether it happens to someone else or to himself, as irrelevant to some degree. But it is a real tension, I think.
It is. He recounts, and this is where we get into this last part of it, where he's talking about, these poor men who had their children killed in front of them. He recounts the story of Cambyses, is it? Cambyses? How do you say it, Judith? Is it Cambyses?
I think it's generally Cambyses, but
Cambyses,
sure.
Thank you, Cambyses. Actions against Praxaspes. No, is that how I say it? He horribly murders the son of
that's fine. Yeah.
Yep. He murders the son of Praxaspes in front of him, and Praxaspes does not outwardly react. Also, he recounts the story of Harpagus and the king of the Persians, who serves serves him up his own children to eat at a banquet, and is reported to have flattered the king about the meal. In both cases, did the two fathers resist angry revenge to avoid further cruelty? She asks. These examples show that anger can be avoided, but Seneca's language here is dramatic and vehement of his condemnations of Cambyses and the Persian king. But also he judges Praxaspes as worse than Cambyses for his lack of response, it seems. Seneca's answer is not to show slavishness and to accept such vile circumstances. His answer is suicide. Here, Seneca adheres to a Stoic tradition regarding suicide. Nussbaum points out that this goes against the worthlessness of externals, which is a relevant point. On one hand, he does not wish the person living under tyranny and butchery to live a life of anger, but he is forced to acknowledge that a detached and mild response in extreme circumstances is disgustingly slavish. He suggests the father court death. He suggests the father court death from the tyrant by reacting in anger, but suicide will preserve humanitas free from corruption in a way that angry resistance does not. Nussbaum counters with a suggestion that Seneca's attachment to purity and integrity is egocentric, doing nothing for others in a selfish sort of non-involvement. Death following resistance may accomplish something for humanity, at least making a statement on behalf of social justice. Suicide as a statement of purity does not show that the world and what happens in it does not matter. In the act of deciding for suicide, the Stoic is deeply implicated in the world and its evils as the angry person, for he judges that human life does matter too much, and some things cut too deeply to permit continued life. This suicide is a type of anger, including a judgment that a grave injustice has been done, and also the judgment that it ought to be punished. Suicide refuses to be involved in the punishing. The only way he punishes the tyrant is to cheat the tyrant of the pleasure of his own murder. We're on page 437. Seneca is here confronting extreme events of his own time and shows his ambivalence to the right response to injustice. The official conclusion is that it is always possible to avoid anger, whether by mild detachment or by suicide. In the case of family love and honor, it is slavish not to let these things matter.
Can you imagine life in Seneca's house? The son would have said, Dad, I don't want to do my homework. Hey, you can go kill yourself then.
He did years later take his own advice. So this is an interesting way to, this is a really grand way for him to practically show us what he believed. He did firstly attempt political resistance. He was implicated in the conspiracy of Piso against Nero. He was accused and took the sentence of death by his own hand with courage and dignity, and showed involvement in human affairs. And it does show involvement in human affairs. He cultivated humanitas till the end, dictating writings while waiting for death. We have seen that the limits of Senecan detachment is indeed the deaths of children. So that's what really seemed to bring out his ire, his own emotion. Chapter 2, so it was the end of that.
I was just going to say it's a bit of she's very clever, Nussbaum, but I think what's the word? It's a bit of a straw man attack, actually, on Seneca. I feel bad saying it because I love Nussbaum so much, but she really, it's a bit of a funny checkmate kind of thing that goes on. And I think she captures it there. Like she's right, but she's missing out some of the more important kind of ideas. Like she says here, you just read it out, but for suicide does not show, cannot possibly show that the world and what happens in it do not matter. In the very act of deciding for suicide, the Stoic has become as deeply implicated in the world and its evils as angry person. And I mean, yeah, there's a truth in that, obviously. If the Stoic can't deal with what's going on in the world or can't act virtuously either way, then he's always got the way out. He's got death. And she's sort of saying, well, see, it does matter what's going on in the world, you know. But I don't think the Stoics would ever say that it doesn't matter what's going on in the world, you know. Of course it matters what's going on in the world. And sometimes you can find yourself in a situation where you cannot act virtuously. And that's still consistent with the Stoic approach.
100%. And that's what Epictetus is always talking about, the open door. You know, the open door's there. If things get to a point where you can't cope and you can't act virtuously, you can't, well, that's the option. But to the point around this final section, I think it's really profound how Seneca, as she shows, addresses the issue of people's children being gratuitously killed, right? So, and it kind of makes you think, well, that's a kind of an extreme situation, and it makes you think how parents respond in that situation. You know, we've got Cambyses, the tyrant, showing his power by gratuitously murdering people's children and seeing how the parents react. Well, how do parents react? If we look at how parents react, well, they react in a whole range of ways, and some of those ways are constructive, and some of those ways are completely pathological and unconstructive. So what Seneca's pointing to is a kind of a crux around human behavior, which we have to think about, we have to address if we're interested in addressing what the extremes of human behavior are. You know, the person who will gratuitously kill someone else's child, unfortunately, those people exist. They're psychopaths, but they exist. They're out there. They're active. Some of them are in great power and some of them aren't. But, he's pointing to something, unfortunately, fundamental in human life and how we react to it.
Yeah, definitely. And even on there's something very dark about the person, like you're saying, who does these horrible acts at that extreme level. And it makes you think of Boethius and his critique of powerless power, because anyone who has gone that far astray and would do such unnatural things, given the Stoic idea that it's like the antithesis of being a human being in the world, has really gone so far astray as a human being that they can only be pitied, you know. And it doesn't matter what veneer they have around them, you know, the palace and the servants and things like that. They have truly failed and they're truly despicable, and if anything, they can have our pity, you know. And yeah, it's really sad for them. You would never want to trade places with someone like that.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like he's just tried to take it to the absolute extreme of how to deal with anger. You know, that's like the most, you know.
So are you cured?
Yeah, well, yeah, sort of. I've been keeping a pretty good handle on it lately.
Oh, done.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we do improve. You know, I think we do, taking a Stoic point of view, we do improve in taking a step back from our reactions and assessing whether they're right or not. I think absolutely.
And maybe that's what makes Seneca's gradualism, as she describes it, makes so much sense, because it takes time to change. and one has to be committed to a particular view of things in order to make those changes, and that requires self-reflection and education and those sorts of things. And I agree with you entirely, Judith. We should offer those opportunities to our children and the people we care about around us, and also that kind of tolerance, so that they can take their time as well in that process. Yeah.
That's a really good point about the education, because, you know, as a young person, there was no one that was able to probably give me good advice about management of emotion. And I think it's paramount. I think it's a really important part of maturing. And yeah, it's just such a lacking, such a vacuum of education around that. Yeah.
Well, guys, that's the end of that. And next fortnight is Medea, which is my favorite chapter.
Yeah, but in the meantime, we're going to be looking at Aristophanes, the clouds, and how the comic poets viewed Socrates.
So is that next funny. Saturday? Is that next Saturday, or is that do you want to bring it back to our normal Saturdays, or are you going to make it a fortnight?
I can't remember which is our normal Saturday. Is it normal? Is it?
No. We just had the thing on the what day is it today? It's Tuesday. We just had it on Saturday, right. So we'll have a week break and then the following Saturday.
All right. So it'll
switched up a little bit.
It'll be a fortnight. You're saying
a fortnight? Yeah.
But I look forward to that. Aristophanes, I'll post that. Do you have the file? Do you have a file to share?
Yeah. I shared it in the group. It's in in the files, so it'll be a bit of light relief.
Sounds lovely. I was going to say on the Medea chapter, I really like the Medea chapter, so I will endeavor to make some decent notes this time. So thanks for putting up with my trying to read through the text as I was going through.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Jody. See you.
Thank you both. Thank you both so much. Good night to you.
Bye.
See you later.